At 72, Juliet Stevenson speaks more softly than ever before. Her voice no longer seeks to convince, to seduce, or to persuade. It simply states what time has already carved into her memory. In the half-light of later years, forgiveness is no longer an ideal. It is a boundary. She once lived under the glare of stage lights and critical praise, her face associated with intelligence, restraint, and emotional precision. To the world, Juliet Stevenson was the embodiment of quiet dignity. But dignity, when practiced for too long, often hides an archive of unspoken wounds. There are silences that protect, and there are silences that slowly suffocate. Today, she sits far from the applause. The mirrors are kinder now, the rooms quieter, and it is here, not in anger, not in scandal, that she allows herself a confession long delayed. At 72, Juliet Stevenson names 5 people she has never forgiven, not because she lacks compassion, but because memory has a way of refusing erasure. Each name belongs to a moment when trust cracked without noise, when loyalty failed politely, when something essential was taken and never returned. These are not explosive betrayals. They are the kind that settle deep, shaping a life from the inside. This is not a reckoning meant for others. It is a reckoning meant for herself. And the most unsettling question remains unanswered. Who are these 5 faces that time could not soften? Juliet Stevenson was born into a world where language mattered more than comfort. Raised in a household shaped by discipline and expectation, she learned early that emotions were something to be mastered, not displayed. Her childhood was not violent, not openly cruel, but quietly demanding, filled with rules, precision, and an unspoken fear of disappointing those she admired most. Her father's presence loomed large, intellectual and exacting, while affection arrived carefully measured. Praise was rare, silence common. Juliet grew up listening more than speaking, observing how words could wound even when spoken softly. She learned that love often arrived with conditions attached. At school, she found refuge in books and voices that were not her own. Acting became less an ambition than a shelter, a place where feelings were permitted as long as they belonged to someone else. Behind the stage curtain, she could finally breathe. Yet the seed of restraint had already taken root. She became skilled at endurance, at absorbing disappointment without protest. When trust faltered, she blamed herself. When bonds fractured, she stayed quiet. This early apprenticeship in silence would define her later life. It taught her how to remain composed when hurt, how to smile when abandoned, how to move forward without closure. Forgiveness, for Juliet, never grew naturally. It was something expected, never learned, fully. By the time Juliet Stevenson entered the professional world, she had already mastered the art of restraint. The theater welcomed her not with spectacle, but with recognition, a quiet acknowledgement that something rare was taking shape. Her voice carried intelligence. Her presence suggested depth without demand. Directors trusted her instinctively, sensing a discipline forged long before the first rehearsal. The 1980s and 1990s became years of steady ascent. Stage roles sharpened her emotional precision, while film and television brought her into public view. She did not chase stardom. It came to her through consistency, through work that refused exaggeration. Audiences admired her subtlety. Critics praised her control. Behind the applause, she carried the weight of expectation like a private burden. Success, however, did not soften her vigilance. The brighter the lights grew, the more carefully she guarded herself. In rehearsal rooms and on set, she observed alliances forming and dissolving, promises spoken lightly, loyalty treated as temporary. She smiled when required, listened when praised, and retreated when the room grew too loud. There were moments of triumph, standing ovations, awards, the quiet pride of knowing she had earned her place. But even then, something remained unresolved. With every role that demanded vulnerability, she learned how easily it could be misused. Trust, she discovered, was a currency rarely protected. She watched others rise faster, fall louder, recover shamelessly. Juliet chose another path, endurance without exposure. Yet this choice came at a cost. The industry rewarded openness but punished fragility. She gave it only what was necessary, holding back what mattered most. In this world of acclaim and shifting allegiances, the first cracks appeared. a promise not kept, a confidence shared and repeated elsewhere. Small betrayals quietly registered, never confronted. She was ascending undeniably, but she was also learning something colder. Success did not guarantee safety. It merely revealed who would stand beside her and who would step away when it mattered. The first rupture did not arrive with violence. It arrived with absence. A conversation postponed, a call never returned, a door that closed without explanation. Juliet Stevenson understood then that betrayal does not always announce itself. Sometimes it simply withdraws. There was a project she believed in, shaped by trust and shared intention. Promises were made quietly, in rooms where collaboration felt sincere. But when decisions were taken elsewhere, her name was absent. Her contribution diminished without warning. No confrontation followed, only polite silence, the kind that leaves no space for defense. In personal life, the pattern repeated. Intimacy demanded exposure, yet exposure was rarely protected. Words shared in confidence resurfaced in public. Support offered in private evaporated when circumstances changed. Each time Juliet chose composure over accusation, she withdrew rather than demanded explanation. These moments accumulated not as dramatic collapses, but as steady erosion. With each disappointment, she learned to expect less, to rely only on herself. Forgiveness was offered outwardly, but it remained performative, a gesture without release. The deepest wound was not inflicted by cruelty, but by indifference. Being overlooked, being replaced, being quietly excluded from decisions that shaped her own work and life. It was in these silent fractures that something hardened. Juliet did not rage. She did not seek reparation. She simply remembered. Names were not spoken aloud, but they were not forgotten either. From that point on, trust became conditional, and forgiveness, once assumed, began to feel undeserved. 5 faces would eventually emerge from this long sequence of absences. 5 stories waiting patiently in the dark. 5 names, 5 presences that never fully left her life, even when their bodies did. Juliet Stevenson carries them not as accusations, but as markers. Moments where something essential broke and was never repaired. The first is a love that arrived quietly and promised safety. He admired her intelligence, her restraint, her discipline. For a time, she believed admiration could become loyalty. But when ambition demanded sacrifice, it was her privacy that was offered first. Intimate words found their way into careless conversations. What was meant to be protected became currency. Juliet did not confront him. She simply withdrew, learning that affection without discretion is another form of betrayal. The second was a colleague, brilliant and charming, whose support felt unwavering until it mattered most. In meetings, he praised her insight. In public, he aligned himself elsewhere. When recognition was distributed, her contribution was minimized, her name conveniently forgotten. It was not hostility that wounded her, but opportunism, the ease with which respect dissolved once it was inconvenient. She never accused him. She never needed to. His silence confirmed everything. The third wound came from closer ground, a family bond shaped by expectation rather than warmth. Love was present, but conditional. Approval depended on achievement, not understanding. When Juliet needed reassurance, she received advice. When she needed empathy, she was offered restraint. Forgiveness here was complicated by affection, but the distance remained. Some disappointments are too foundational to be erased. They shape the architecture of a life. The fourth presence was not a person, but a force. The industry itself. An environment that celebrated sensitivity while punishing vulnerability. Juliet watched as narratives were shaped without her consent, as her silence was mistaken for agreement. She was praised for dignity while being excluded from decisions that defined her career. Public admiration masked private neglect. This betrayal was visible, collective, and strangely impersonal. And yet it left one of the deepest marks. Then comes the fifth. The one name she hesitated to admit, even to herself. Because the fifth person Juliet Stevenson has never forgiven is Juliet Stevenson. For staying silent when she should have spoken. for accepting conditions she should have refused, for mistaking endurance for strength. She blames herself for the years spent protecting others at her own expense, for believing that composure would earn respect, for forgiving too quickly, too often without repair. This final reckoning is not cruel, it is honest, and perhaps the most painful of all. Because in the end, the hardest forgiveness is not extended outward. It is the one we deny ourselves. Now at 72, Juliet Stevenson lives in a quieter light. The rooms are smaller, the mirrors more forgiving. Time no longer presses her to explain herself. What remains are not the betrayals, but the understanding they forced upon her. She has learned that forgiveness is not an obligation, it is a choice. And sometimes a refusal is the only way to stay whole. The faces she remembers no longer wound her daily, yet they shape the boundaries she now protects with care. Silence, once a shield, has become a language she controls. There is no triumph in her confessions, no release that feels complete, only a calm acceptance that some wounds are meant to be carried, not healed. They remind her of what mattered, of what was given without return, of who she became by surviving quietly. As evening falls, her voice softens, but it does not waver. She does not ask for understanding. She leaves us instead with two questions, suspended in the fading light. Is forgiveness always a virtue, or sometimes a surrender? And can a life be fully lived without ever forgiving the one who endured it all?